in his usual weekly spot. Normally he's on Friday, but we bumped him up a day because there's so much going on and so much to talk about. My colleague from the NFL Network and NFL Insiders, Tom Pelissero. Good to see you, Tommy.
Hey. What's up, Rich?
Tom.
What's up to the boys in the studio?
Hey, what's up, baby? Let's go.
Good seeing you guys.
How you doing?
Good seeing you, man.
It's all great. Oh, he's got the Rich Eisen Show mug. We're all rowing in the same direction.
Yeah.
I like it. Thank you,
I stole
Tom.
it last time I was filling in hosting.
Hey, listen, Tommy, five-fingered Pelissero here on the Rich Eisen Show.
I'm security. You better
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't even know where to begin, but we got to start with the latest. Why did Mike McDaniel learn today? What happened in Miami that caused the Dolphins to tell Mike McDaniel he is, in fact, out?
So this was a product of a bunch of different discussions that have been going on for quite some time. Mike McDaniel met with Stephen Ross on Tuesday. He laid out, I was told, just a vision and the plan for where they were going to go in the future. It sounded like that meeting, from McDaniel's perspective, went well. He had had discussions with his coaching staff as recently as yesterday. He was doing exit interviews with players and laying out the groundwork for the offseason, detailed enough that it was, all right, Quinn Ewers, lead the throwing sessions with the skill guys in Texas during the break in the offseason. This was not a guy, Mike McDaniel, who thought he was going to come into the office today and be fired. But Stephen Ross gave it a lot of different thought. Ross had said at the end of last season that the status quo is not good enough. Certainly, Mike did everything he could down the stretch. You look at the second half of the season, I think they went 6-3. They rallied after the firing of GM Chris Greer. Miami, by the way, is in round 2 of their GM interviews. Those guys are in the building starting today. They should have a GM in place in the next day or two. But, Stephen Ross thought it over about where the team was going. He ultimately decided to go for the full organizational reset. It's not unprecedented. It is unusual to fire your head coach on a Thursday, but I would also say the events of the past several days have been unusual in many regards across the NFL. My personal belief, Rich, we talked about this on the Insiders on game day morning on this show, was that the only way that Mike McDaniel was going to be out was if the Dolphins came to the belief that they could potentially get a clear upgrade. Well, all of a sudden, you have the likes of Kevin Stefanski and then certainly John Harbaugh becoming available. This was not a linear, they've got a deal in place with John Harbaugh and he's the new coach. It's not that. In fact, I talked to Brian Harlan, John Harbaugh's agent, within the past half hour. He said he has not heard yet from the Dolphins. He's heard from the other 6 teams that had vacancies when Harbaugh was let go, but the Dolphins' plan has been hire the GM, then turn their attention to the head coach process. For Harbaugh, who certainly wants to have alignment with the GM wherever he goes, we'll see exactly how that process plays out and how that potentially might impact the chances, if any, that John Harbaugh is the next coach of the Miami Dolphins.
So this was not Harbaugh's free, let's bounce our coach and start a search, and he could still wind up, obviously, in Miami. So you're saying this was not a Harbaugh-related decision from Stephen Ross at all? What about any involvement of the new inner circle that involves a colleague at ESPN's in Troy Aikman? Tom, what about that? What are you hearing there?
Troy Aikman has been, involved with the GM search, and he was tapped a few weeks ago. Had done a lot of research in terms of, what the best people were to bring in from the best organizations across the NFL, and that's where they had it narrowed down to John Eric Sullivan, who's a highly respected executive for the Packers, Josh Williams, who's an up and comer out there, in San Francisco, Chad Alexander, who worked in Baltimore and does have a connection. He's currently the Chargers assistant GM. There is a connection there with the Harbaughs. And then Champ Kelly, the interim GM, is also one of the 4 finalists that's doing in-person interviews here. But with regard to John Harbaugh, this is not down the line right now. I know that people, may have doubts about the veracity of some of these things. And I would pump the brakes a little on this idea, that 25 different teams all called and offered John Harbaugh the job within 5 minutes of him being fired by the Ravens. There's a lot of interest. There is no doubt about that. And like I said, the other 6 teams that have head coaching vacancies have checked in some capacity on John Harbaugh, and I fully anticipate that the Dolphins, who, of course, Stephen Ross, a Michigan man who was a big fan of Jim Harbaugh but never wanted to poach the head coach from his alma mater, has a great affinity for the Harbaugh family that, maybe there's, a connection, or there definitely is a connection there where he would be intrigued about John Harbaugh. I would also point to this. John Harbaugh is a highly accomplished coach. He has won a Super Bowl. He's also 63 years old. This is, in many ways, a young man's league. The oldest head coach in the NFC playoff field this year is Matt LaFleur. That's the makeup of head coaches right now. Of course, on the AFC side, Jim Harbaugh is in. Sean Payton, who is very similar in age to John Harbaugh, has done an unbelievable job in Denver. I'm not sitting here saying that John Harbaugh has somehow aged himself out, and the level of interest that he has certainly backs that up. But every team is going to have different criteria for what they're looking to hire, which brings us to what are the logical landing spots for John Harbaugh?
Yes, sir.
I would say this. Nothing is off the table. And again, I spoke to Brian Harlan a short time ago, John Harbaugh's agent. He told me John is taking a few days to decompress. He's getting his daughter back to college. He wants to see what all the options are and, be able to kind of think through what he wants to do next. I personally, speaking for myself, Rich, I don't see John Harbaugh as the next head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. That's not been their MO in terms of jumping out quick and paying top dollar for a top coach. Arizona's never done that. Doesn't mean they can't. I don't really see it going that direction. I don't see him as the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders, being in a division with his brother as well as his mentor in Andy Reid. I don't see that being the fit for John Harbaugh. The places that make sense to me for John Harbaugh, Miami is certainly one, though again, John Harbaugh is going to want to have alignment, if not be able to have a strong voice in his GM. Miami right now is moving forward as if they are going to hire a GM. That's their full intention in the next day or two. Atlanta makes a lot of sense. Arthur Blank talked about it earlier today, saying they'd like to talk to John Harbaugh if he's willing to talk to them. But they are also pretty far down the line in terms of the interview process, where they're interviewing a bunch of people for this president of football job that is widely believed to be Matt Ryan's job. And then in turn, they'll hire somebody else into the general manager role. That all could be done in the next 48 hours. The other place that makes sense is the New York Giants. Joe Schoen is running that search. New York has reaffirmed its commitment to Joe Schoen. My understanding is Joe Schoen has certainly, to say the least, been recruiting John Harbaugh while also interviewing other head coaching candidates. There's all kinds of reasons that New York, at the center of this, would appear to be the logical spot for John Harbaugh. But it is not a slam dunk. It is not a done deal. This is not waiting out, them checking boxes and talking to other people. I mean, they've got other strong candidates. Kevin Stefanski was in the building. I believe Raheem Morris is there today. Antonio Pierce is going to interview tomorrow. They've got some Zoom set up with guys like Vance Joseph. And Mike McCarthy is coming in next week. I'm told that he's going to be in there Monday night, have dinner, and interview on Tuesday. If you do a blind resume, Rich, and I did this the other day,
yes,
and sent it to a few people, just as a test, there are 4 coaches who were all hired between 2006 and 2008 to their first head coaching jobs. They all have one Super Bowl win. They've all won between 60 and 63% of their games, and they've all been to the playoffs either 12 or 13 times. Those 4 coaches are Sean Payton, Mike Tomlin, John Harbaugh, and Mike McCarthy. For whatever reason, Mike McCarthy's name comes up and doesn't seem to get the same massive response that John Harbaugh's does. But Mike McCarthy's also the one guy out of that group, along with Sean Payton, who is a quarterback guy, who has worked with him. I think that Mike McCarthy is a completely logical fit for what New York wants to do. So let's see how these processes roll out. There will be nothing precluding the Giants by even this weekend of hiring a head coach. But again, when I asked Brian Harlan, he said absolutely not going to be, all right, they check the Rooney Rule boxes and they just hire John on Saturday. That's not going to happen. Potentially, they'll regroup over the weekend. He could take one visit. He could take 2 or 3. This might be like an old school coaching search, Rich, 20, 30 years ago, where it was, all right, you order those top 3 teams, and if you take the first visit and you don't get a deal done with him,
see ya.
He's out of the building. He's going someplace else. This could set up that way for John Harbaugh. Nothing is set right now. Nothing is scheduled. But that first team could be the New York Giants. We're just going to have to see exactly how this plays out.
Tom Pelissero here on the Rich Eisen Show. And I appreciate you, turning the page and about what's next. And I guess that the fact that the Dolphins fired Mike McDaniel and there's already so much interest in John Harbaugh and things move so fast, it's kind of crazy that my first question to you wasn't what happened in Baltimore, right? I mean, so let's pause before we turn the page to the next steps again. What happened, Tom, in Baltimore?
I have spoken to a number of people very familiar with the dynamics in that building, both during the season and over the past couple of days. First of all, I think that it would be naive to sit there and say that in a locker room of 70 high testosterone, high performing men, you're going to be 70 were in on John Harbaugh or 70 were out. There were probably differing opinions like there are in every single building. But my understanding has been there was a general frustration. It was not all directed at John Harbaugh. There was a general frustration of a season that seemed to go sideways from go.
Right.
Week 1, they've got that game won in Baltimore. They looked like world beaters. They're future Super Bowl champions. Derrick Henry fumbles the ball. That game goes sideways. All of a sudden, you're off to a 1-5 start. And everything after that, the emotional energy that went into trying to claw back from that weighed on people. There were times during the season that I was told Lamar Jackson, who had, I think, every lower body part plus his back by the end that was on the injury report. It was an ankle, it was a knee, it was a foot, it was his back. He was worn out. It got to the point, and obviously he missed some time during the season where there were times Lamar just felt like, I don't want to be out there. And that's not in any way to cast aspersions on Lamar, the competitor. It's more about he didn't feel like he could function at that level. There were injuries at every level of that team. And when you get to the end of it and you have that level of disappointment, where let's remember, we could easily be talking about the Ravens hosting a playoff game this week against the Texans if Tyler Loop, the hand-picked kicker that was, picked by John Harbaugh, former special teams coordinator, doesn't slice a field goal at Acrisure Stadium. That's the thin margin between John Harbaugh being in the playoffs and John Harbaugh right now being out of a job. This was not a team that quit. This was not a team that was completely done. Were there certain players that felt like change was needed? I'm sure there were. And I know that the team brass and Steve Bisciotti talked to some of those players, and I'm sure that they heard a variety of different opinions. But, frankly, I got a text from John Harbaugh yesterday. And one of the things that he said was this was actually one of his, I believe he said, most rewarding years, favorite years, because of the way that the team battled through adversity to give themselves a chance. You're 1-5. The statistics, the history of the NFL would say you're done. They did battle back. But there was always something that never felt like it was clicking through the course of the season. And a big piece of that was the two-time NFL MVP quarterback whose mobility, his playmaking ability, his elusiveness didn't look like the Lamar Jackson we've seen of old. That had a trickle-down effect on everything else. So Steve Bisciotti made that decision. It was shocking enough to people involved that John Harbaugh, as recently as that day, was talking to about his assistant coaches about what the future was going to hold for them. Staff members got called into a meeting with Eric DeCosta and the team president, Sashi Brown, in which they said, Steve made a change. We'll get back to you with more information. Everybody was taken aback. There was always a chance. We all talked about it, Rich. Could something happen with John Harbaugh? Usually, though, after 18 years in a franchise, these are the type of organizational decisions. We had conversations and parted ways. It was abundantly clear from the statement from Steve Bisciotti, the statement from John Harbaugh. John Harbaugh was fired after 18 years in Baltimore. You look back at the number, I believe 4 playoff wins since 2013 over a 13-year span. You understand some of that. They've been a very patient and consistent franchise. Steve Bisciotti's patience ran out, but it was with the overall program and the direction they were going. They felt like they needed a reboot, and that is going to be a highly coveted job in Baltimore.
Tom Pelissero here on the Rich Eisen Show. Okay, so now with Harbaugh out there and on the market and, the wild card weekend coming up, are there any teams whose coaches are playing for their jobs this weekend? Because this whole Harbaugh's gone and McDaniel is gone, now that Harbaugh's gone, but it's not really because Harbaugh's gone, is a 2-day stretch of a coaching carousel that's so unique. I have to figure that we're not done in some way, shape, or form, Tom. Are there any coaches coaching for their gig this weekend, do you think?
There's a wise football man that I talk to a lot this time of year whose phrase is always, the owners are always watching the owners. In other words, when all of a sudden, let's say the Browns fire a two-time NFL Coach of the Year in Kevin Stefanski, the Falcons fire a coach who ended on a 4-game winning streak in year 2 in Raheem Morris. Then John Harbaugh gets fired by the Ravens. There are owners who suddenly start to rethink their position and go, wait, they fired those guys and we're keeping this guy? That is a real phenomenon within the league, and that's where sometimes you see these ripple effect firings that don't take place on the proverbial Black Monday. We've had a Black Tuesday, we've had a Black Thursday this week, and there oftentimes is one more that comes next week. I don't think that it's any secret who potentially those teams could be, or at minimum what has been speculated about in league circles. You start with Pittsburgh. I have no reason to believe at this point, based on my understanding of how Mike Tomlin has proceeded about his business in recent weeks, the type of conversations that happen internally, the way that he's focused on this team, I have no reason to believe the rampant rumors that I get 5 calls about a day that Mike Tomlin is going to walk away and take a year off. He could do that. Mike Tomlin would have a TV job in about 5 seconds. But does Mike Tomlin actually want to do that? I don't get that sense from people who are around Mike Tomlin on a daily basis. Could he go to Art Rooney and say, you know what, I want to go someplace else? I could certainly see Mike Tomlin being appealing to, let's say, a Miami Dolphins that have now made a change. But is any situation going to be better than the one that Mike Tomlin has in Pittsburgh, where he's got authority over really everything? He's got the ultimate job security. I don't envision a scenario where Art Rooney is moving on from a guy who's never had a losing season and is in the playoffs for the 13th time in 19 years, albeit without a playoff win over the past nearly a decade here. So for Mike Tomlin, he's going to make that call, or he'll make none. And he'll say, Aaron Rodgers quite possibly wants to come back. We really made strides down the stretch. We're finally playing the style we want to. Maybe I'll give this another run in 2026. We'll see how that plays out. But we won't know that unless and until the Steelers are out, which they don't play until Monday night against the Texans. There's certainly been speculation about Buffalo. I would also say Sean McDermott is one of the fastest, if not the fastest coach in NFL history to 100 wins in 9 years. He's been highly successful in the NFL. But again, to use that theory of the owners watching the other owners, Terry Pegula is not blind to what's going on in other places. If you are firing John Harbaugh because he's not getting over the hump with Lamar Jackson, do you consider just, hey, Sean McDermott's a great and highly successful coach, but maybe we need a different voice? Again, there's nothing in motion at this time, but let's see what happens on Sunday in Jacksonville and then find out if we get another stunner. And then the other one that just is a topic because of the situation contractually is in Green Bay. Matt LaFleur is, again, the oldest coach in the NFC playoff field at age 46. He's in the middle of his career. He's got a long way to go. But Matt LaFleur, if you just look at the market here, the market dynamics, Rich, and they exploded last year with coaching contracts, both for veteran coaches and for first-timers. Matt LaFleur, objectively speaking, is a $15 million a year coach in the NFL. The Packers are not paying him 15, I'll tell you that right now at this time. If they decide, you know what, we're not willing to go there, or we're not willing to commit long term, then there's decisions that everybody needs to make. Does Matt say, I'm just going to coach out 2026? Does he say, all right, cool, if you're not going to pay me, then let's work out something with another team that was willing to make a long-term commitment, and maybe I could just turn loose my agent to go negotiate a contract and then work out compensation in a trade? Do they just decide to part ways? I personally believe that is unlikely right now. I believe that the Packers would be making, frankly, subjectively to me, a huge mistake, letting go a guy who is not just one of the most successful youngish coaches in the NFL, but also a top 5 play caller in the NFL. That is not an easy guy to replace, all of which makes me believe, Brian Gutekunst's contract also has 1 year left, the GM. It makes me believe they're going to find a way to work this thing out. But coaches are very aware of their value. You remember in Minnesota last year, Rich, there were rumors about, well, somebody tried to trade for Kevin O'Connell. What does the future hold there? The Vikings, if memory serves, had a deal done with Kevin O'Connell like 4 days after the season, 10 days after the season, whatever it was. It was right after. It was in January. They immediately took care of business. I think the timeline applies. It's the same agency that represents Matt LaFleur, that represents Kevin O'Connell. I have no reason to believe that they're not going to see if they can get something done. But if they can't, or if they're not on the same page of what Matt LaFleur is worth, then that opens up other possibilities. So right there, you've got three teams that, while it seems unlikely on paper that anything happens with any of those, we've already seen some unlikely things happen just in the past few days.
All right, Tommy. In the just 2 minutes I have left, I'm going to go off the board and just go a little crazy here, because I did mention on Monday's show, if I'm a team in the NFL, I throw a dart in the direction of Bloomington, Indiana, and I just say, what do you think, Curt Cignetti? Is there any reason for us to even keep the door open? You hearing anything on that front?
Rich, I always know that you're fired up with a theory when you're actively texting me about it late at night, musings.
Yes. Yes.
I
have very little life, Tom. Is that what you're trying to say to the ESPN audience? Is that what you're trying to say?
I just always know what you're really interested in, because they're the things you text late at night. That's when I can always tell. It's like,
at least it's about football.
This is the rich part of things that I deeply enjoy. I mean, I don't think that it's completely out of pocket to say, why wouldn't you? I mean, the question, we talked about this last week, Rich, it's who is going to fill these jobs? And I said at that time, this cycle will be defined in part by who gets fired and becomes available for other jobs. Right. We're already seeing that take place. You still don't have a lot of dialed up, the classic young coordinator candidates to get hired across the board. So, there were multiple teams. The Titans and the Giants, at minimum, did a lot of homework on Marcus Freeman. Ultimately, Marcus Freeman went back to Notre Dame. I anticipate he'll get a new deal there, but he'll be a name to watch in the future. Curt Cignetti doesn't fit any box, but Google him. He wins. And that's what he's done his entire career. It would make sense for people to at least inquire. Cignetti, though, also just got a new deal. He doesn't strike me as somebody who is chasing that extra $5 million a year, chasing the next level. It's a unique situation because Fernando Mendoza quite possibly could be the number one pick. I think the more likely scenario, Rich, is that you will see NFL teams showing interest in other members of his coaching staff. Chandler Whitmer is one, who is the quarterback's coach and co-offensive coordinator, who I know the teams have some level of interest in. So even if it's not getting Curt Cignetti, when you're drafting Fernando Mendoza and you are, like with all young quarterbacks, trying to build that nest, which is not one person, it's many people around him, bringing in someone like Whitmer who can help bridge the gap between what Mendoza did at Indiana and what he will need to do in the NFL, I would say that would be a more likely scenario than Curt Cignetti making the jump. Also, Curt Cignetti is not a guy who is going to pull Lane Kiffin and just, hit the eject button in the middle of a playoff run here. If anybody's going to make a run at Curt Cignetti, that's probably still, I don't know when they play again, but at least a few days, if not a couple of weeks away.
Yes, they play tomorrow night, and then after that, the 19th, and after that, the season's over, somewhat like this segment. Tom, thanks again. Greatly appreciate your time and your information, and we'll chat again very, very soon.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, fellas. Pelissero, NFL Network insider, and I greatly appreciate the multiple sips of the Rich Eisen Show mug in the middle of transitioning from segment to segment and topic to topic. Hey, you made it all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Check us out every single day streaming live on Disney Plus and the ESPN app 12 to 3 Eastern.